In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at the buffer object. Usually, whenever we receive data from a file or from some other stream, like from a remote server, that data cannot be natively used by JavaScript. In order to make it consumable, we have to convert the raw data into usable format. And for that, we make use of the buffer object. For instance, we have a file over here, and you can see that it's sample.txt file, which is just having one line. Now, if I go ahead and try reading it out in the REPL environment, so here I'll type node and press enter. Now inside this REPL environment, I'm making use of file stream read file, and you can see that I have passed the name of the file, that is sample.txt, and a callback function, which is having two parameters, error and data. Then we are simply logging the data, and now if I press enter over here, you can see that some kind of buffer is coming up. Obviously, this data is not human readable, and it's not of any use to us if it's in this format. In order to resolve this, what we'll be doing is we'll modify the log that we have over here, console.log. Now you can see that we have updated it, and the console.log now contains data.toString. Now let's try and execute this function. And here you can see that the same line is printed, which we have over here in our file, sample.txt. There's one more way of achieving the same, and that is by specifying the file encoding. So we'll go over here. Here you can see that just after the file name, we have specified the file encoding. Over here we are saying UTF-8. Notice that the console.log now contains just data, not data.toString. Now if I press enter over here, you can see that we're getting the same result all over again. There are certain methods available to us when we make use of the buffer object. We'll be exploring those now. The first thing is we can write to our buffer by making use of the write method. For instance, if I go ahead and create a new buffer in this fashion, here you can see that we are simply specifying the buffer size by mentioning it just after the constructor. That is, the buffer will hold 10 characters. Now if I go ahead and write it over here something, so we'll say buffer.write, and inside this let's write hi node. You can see the length coming up as we executed that line. And here if I say buffer.toString, you'll get the value. Now if I have to overwrite something in the same buffer, I can simply specify the position. So I'll say buffer.write wow, and then 2, for instance, press enter, and here let's check this out now. So you can see that the position starts with 0, 1, 2. That was the space here. You can see that it's not having the wow word inserted just after second index position. Now if I go ahead and also specify the length of character that needs to be written, so I'll say buffer.write, let's say now, 2, 1. Now in this case, if I execute this and print it again, you'll see at second position it has just inserted the word N. The OW remains from wow. And the last alternative to this one is by specifying the file encoding as well. The default encoding obviously is UTF-8, so you can specify it over here in this fashion, press enter, and then you can check it out over here. There's some functions available like compare, equals, that we'll be exploring now. So if we have some buffer objects like this, and let's have a couple of more over here. So we have created 3 buffer objects: buffer E, buffer X, and buffer Y. Now if I go ahead and say buffer E equals buffer X, if you see, buffer E is 12 and buffer X is also having the value 12, so this should return true, and equals returns true or false, not some integer value like 1 or 0. Now let's go ahead and check out the compare. So the compare method will return an integer value. Here we are saying buffer E compare buffer Y. Buffer E is 12 and buffer Y is 10, so obviously you'll get a value 1 which says not matching. If I go ahead and change this to buffer X and then execute this line, you'll see a 0 coming up, which means that buffer E and buffer X are equal. Next we have slice method in our buffer object. So here I'm creating a new buffer object which has this content hello node, and if I have to slice it out in this way, buff slice equals buffer n dot slice 0,2. Press enter here, and now if I go ahead and say buff slice dot toString, you'll see the characters coming up as H and E over here. Now whenever we make use of the slice method, we are not creating a new buffer object. Rather than that, we are simply pointing to the same buffer that we created earlier, that is over here. It's pointing to buffer n, and it's just taking that 2 characters into account. So if I go ahead and make some modifications to buff slice, and then if we check buffer n, the changes will be shown there as well. Let's check this out now. So here if I say buff slice dot right, and here instead of he, let's write hi in semicolon. Now let's go ahead and check it out, the content of buff slice. So obviously it will say hi. But if I go ahead now and say buffer n dot toString, remember we had buffer n as hello node, but now if I go ahead and check it out, it's saying hi low node. So you can see that the reference was there when we made use of the slice method. So that was buffer object in Node.js.